Every time you feel the urge to prove someone wrong, you are handing them a piece of your future for free. They didn't ask for it. They didn't earn it. But you gave it to them anyway, the moment you decided their opinion was worth more than your progress. This is the trap almost nobody talks about. Not laziness. Not fear. Not even failure. The trap is proving. And the way out of it is something most people never learn on purpose. They stumble into it late in life, usually after years of wasted energy, and they call it wisdom. You don't have to wait that long. Here is the core idea, and I want you to hear it clearly in the first minute, because everything after this is just proof of how deep it goes. Improvement is an investment, proof is an expense. Improvement compounds silently over years and pays you back for the rest of your life. Proving is a withdrawal you make today, spent entirely on someone else's opinion of you, and it gives you nothing back tomorrow. Take time to improve. Don't waste time to prove. That's the whole law. Now let's understand why almost everyone breaks it, and what it actually costs them. Start with a simple, uncomfortable question. When was the last time you did something specifically because someone doubted you? Not because you wanted it. Not because it moved you forward. But because you wanted them to see, to admit, to regret ever underestimating you. Sit with that memory for a second. Now ask yourself honestly, did winning that moment actually change your life? Or did it just feel good for an hour, and then quietly evaporate, leaving you exactly where you started, except a little more exhausted? That's the first psychological trapdoor, the need for external validation. Human beings are wired for it. For most of our evolutionary history, being seen positively by your tribe wasn't a vanity project, it was survival. Exile from the group often meant death. So the brain built a reward circuit that treats social approval almost like food or safety. When someone doubts you, ancient parts of your brain register it as a threat to your standing in the group, and they scream at you to respond, to correct the record, to restore your status immediately. That scream feels urgent. It feels like ambition. It is either. It's a fire alarm going off because of burnt toast. The problem is that this circuit doesn't know the difference between a life-or-death exile and a stranger's comment on the internet, or a relative's snide remark at dinner, or a former boss who said you'd never make it. It reacts the same way regardless of the size of the actual stakes. And so people spend decades of real, irreplaceable time responding to burnt toast as if it were a burning house. Here's where it gets more interesting, and this is where manipulation enters the picture. People who understand this circuit, consciously or instinctively, can pull it like a lever. This is one of the oldest tricks in human influence. Bait someone's ego, and they will spend their own resources trying to disprove you, on your schedule, using your terms, fighting on ground you chose. A rival who doubts your business publicly isn't always being careless. Sometimes he's making a calculated bet that you'll burn a year of runway trying to prove him wrong in the exact way he predicted, instead of quietly outbuilding him where he isn't looking. A partner who says, "You'll never change," isn't always speaking their honest belief. Sometimes they're installing a challenge they know you'll accept, because a person busy trying to prove something is a person who has stopped asking harder questions about the relationship itself. The insult is the hook. Your reaction is the trap closing. This is why the most dangerous manipulators rarely need to control you directly. They just need to understand what you're desperate to prove, and then dangle the opposite of it in front of you. From there, you do the rest of the work yourself, and you'll even thank them for the motivation. So the first shift in mindset isn't ignore criticism. That's naive, and it isn't what this is about. The shift is learn to separate signal from bait. Signal is information that, if true, would actually help you get better. Bait is information designed only to trigger a reaction. The test is simple. If this person disappeared tomorrow and never found out what you did next, would you still take the exact same action? If yes, it's signal. Use it, adjust, move on. If no, if the entire point was making sure they saw it, it's bait, and you've just been handed a leash with your own hand. Now let's talk about what improvement actually looks like, because improve, don't prove sounds nice on a poster, but almost nobody explains the mechanism underneath it. Real improvement is boring. It has no audience. It happens in rooms nobody is filming. This is the part that trips people up, because we live in an era where visibility has been confused with progress. If it wasn't posted, did it ever happen? Yes. It happened. In fact, the version of growth that happens without an audience is usually the only version that's real, because the moment an audience is present, a second incentive sneaks in, the incentive to look good, rather than to get good. Those two incentives feel similar but pull in opposite directions almost every time. Think about how a chess grandmaster is built. Not in tournaments. Tournaments are where existing skill gets tested, not where it gets created. The actual skill is built in solitary hours analyzing lost games, replaying the exact moment a decision went wrong, feeling the specific discomfort of being shown, again and again, precisely how you failed, with no opponent to blame, no audience to perform for, nothing to prove to anyone except the board itself. That repeated, private confrontation with your own error is the entire mechanism of mastery. Public proving skips that step entirely. It goes straight for the applause and leaves the actual construction site abandoned. This gives us a working definition we can actually use. Improvement is what you do when no one is checking. Proving is what you do because someone is checking. Once you can label your own behavior using that filter, most of your daily decisions become obvious. The gym session you do only because someone might see your before and after post is proving. The gym session you do at 5 a.m. before anyone else is awake, with no post planned at all, is improving. Same movement, same sweat, completely different psychological architecture, and only one of them survives the day nobody's watching. Let's go deeper into why proving is so expensive because waste of time undersells it. Proving isn't neutral, it's actively costly in 3 specific ways, and almost nobody adds them up. The first cost is direction. The moment your actions are aimed at someone else's opinion, that person is now steering your life, even though they have no responsibility for the outcome. You've effectively outsourced your compass to someone who doesn't even know they're holding it. If they change their mind, get bored, or move on, your effort was still spent, but now it's spent on a target that no longer exists. Improvement, on the other hand, is aimed at a fixed internal standard, so it never goes stale, because you're the one who owns the target. The second cost is timing. Proving demands a deadline set by someone else's attention span. You feel pressure to show results now, publicly, before the doubt fades from memory, which pushes you toward shortcuts, exaggeration, and shallow wins that look good quickly but don't hold weight later. Improvement has no deadline except the one you set based on what the skill actually requires. That's why so many overnight transformations quietly collapse a year later. They were built on prove time, not improved time, and prove time construction is famously unstable. The third cost is the most expensive, and it's rarely discussed: identity capture. When your effort becomes about proving someone wrong, your success and your enemy become permanently linked in your own mind. Years later, when you finally succeed, you don't feel free, you feel obligated to keep succeeding at them, because your entire narrative was built around their doubt as the origin story. People who build empires purely to spite an ex, a parent, or a doubter often find that even at the top, they're still, quietly, having the same argument in their head that started 15 years earlier. They never actually left the room where the insult happened. They just built a mansion around it. Compare that to identity built through improvement. The goalpost was never another person's mouth. It was a version of yourself you were trying to reach. When you get there, you're simply free. There's no debt to repay to anyone, because you never borrowed the motivation from them in the first place. Now, here's a twist that most self-help content misses entirely, and it's important, so pay close attention. This isn't an argument for pure isolation or ignoring the outside world. Feedback still matters. Markets still matter. Other people's honest assessment of your work can be some of the most valuable data you'll ever receive. The distinction isn't never listen to anyone. The distinction is between using outside input as fuel for adjustment versus using outside doubt as fuel for your ego. A coach who tells an athlete their footwork is wrong is offering signal. Use it, adjust the footwork, move on without needing the coach to witness the improvement. A crowd that mocks the same athlete for a bad game is offering bait, dressed as motivation, but actually just noise engineered to trigger a reaction, often from people who have never once stepped onto that field themselves. The skill you're building here, the real skill underneath everything, is discernment under emotional pressure. Almost anyone can tell the difference between useful feedback and empty noise when they're calm, rested, and unprovoked. The test only gets hard the moment your pride is on the line, because pride has a way of making bait feel exactly like signal, dressed up as healthy competitiveness, or using the hate as fuel. That phrase, using the hate as fuel, sounds tough, but examine it honestly. Fuel that comes from someone else's negativity runs out the second they stop being negative. What happens to your drive on the day nobody's talking about you anymore? If the answer is, it disappears, it was never really your fuel. You were just borrowing someone else's fire and calling it your own. This is where discipline enters, not as a moral virtue, but as a practical replacement fuel source. Discipline is what allows improvement to continue on days when there's no audience, no insult, and no deadline, the days that make up roughly 90% of any long journey. Motivation, especially the kind sparked by wanting to prove something, is loud but short-lived, like a match. Discipline is quiet but structural, like a foundation. You don't need to feel inspired to lay one brick. You just need a system that makes laying the brick the default action, regardless of your mood, regardless of who's watching, regardless of whether anyone doubted you that morning. Practically, this looks like building your goals around process metrics, not proof metrics. A proof metric asks, does this make me look successful to others? A process metric asks, did I execute the specific, repeatable action that produces skill over time? If your only measurement is public perception, you will always be at the mercy of an audience that owes you nothing and forgets you by next week. If your measurement is, did I complete the deliberate practice block today? You now control the entire scoreboard yourself, and no one can revoke your win by simply looking away. Let's bring in the wealth angle here, because this exact pattern shows up almost identically in how people relate to money, and it's one of the clearest places to see the difference between improving and proving. There are two financial postures that look similar from a distance but produce opposite outcomes over a lifetime. One posture spends to demonstrate wealth, the car, the watch, the trip posted at the right angle, purchased specifically because it will be seen. This is financial proving. It requires a constant stream of income to sustain the appearance, because the appearance itself produces nothing, it only consumes. The other posture spends to build wealth, acquiring assets, skills, and systems that generate more value over time, largely invisible to anyone outside the person's own ledger. This is financial improving. It requires patience precisely because no one applauds a retirement account, a paid-off debt, or a boring, unglamorous business that simply compounds quietly for a decade. The uncomfortable truth is that most visible wealth signals are actually a tax people pay to feel proven, and most durable wealth is built by people willing to look unremarkable for years while their balance sheet does the talking eventually, on nobody's timeline but their own. If you want a genuinely reliable predictor of who will still be standing financially in 20 years, don't look at who spends the loudest today. Look at who's still quietly reinvesting on the exact same Tuesday that nobody's watching. Now let's step into the psychology of the people around you, because part of mastering this idea is understanding how it plays out socially, not just internally. There is a specific type of relationship dynamic worth naming clearly. Some people will only respect you once you've proven something to them, and will never respect the quiet process that got you there. These people are, functionally, an unreliable audience. Approval from them is conditional, delayed, and often moved further away the moment you get close, almost like the finish line has legs. You've likely met someone like this. No accomplishment is ever quite enough. There's always a next hurdle they mention, right after you clear the last one. Chasing their approval isn't a project with an end date, it's a treadmill disguised as a staircase. The strategic response isn't confrontation. It isn't a speech. It's withdrawal of the performance, while keeping the relationship civil if needed. You simply stop supplying the show. You keep improving, at your own pace, on your own criteria, and you let their opinion become irrelevant through neglect rather than argument. This drives a certain kind of person almost insane, because their entire influence over you depended on your willingness to keep performing for their verdict. Remove the performance, and the leash goes slack in their hand, whether they ever say a word about it or not. This is quiet, and it's far more effective than any argument could ever be, because arguments are still a form of proving. You're just proving it out loud instead of through results. There's a deeper layer here worth sitting with, something philosophers have circled for thousands of years using different language. The idea maps closely onto what old Stoic thinkers called the dichotomy of control. Some things are within your power, and everything else is not. Your effort, your discipline, your daily choices, your character, fully within your control. Other people's opinions, their timing of respect, their willingness to ever admit you were right, never within your control, no matter how hard you try to force it. Spending your finite life energy trying to manage what was never yours to manage is, by definition, wasted motion. The moment you redirect that same energy toward what actually is yours to manage, your own improvement, you stop fighting battles you were never equipped to win in the first place, because the terrain belonged to someone else's mind the entire time. There's a similar idea in older Taoist thought, expressed through the concept of effortless action, not laziness, but action so aligned with its natural direction that it requires no forcing, no straining against the grain, no performance for onlookers. A river doesn't pause to prove to the rocks that it will eventually wear them smooth. It simply keeps flowing, on its own schedule, indifferent to whether the rocks are convinced yet. Centuries later, the rocks are sand, and the river never once needed the rock's agreement to get there. There's a modern version of this trap that's worth naming precisely, because it didn't exist in the same form a generation ago. Social platforms have industrialized the proving instinct and turned it into a business model. Every app you scroll is quietly built to reward the performance of achievement over the achievement itself, because performance generates engagement, and engagement generates revenue for someone else, not for you. A workout only counts, in the algorithm's eyes, if it's filmed. A win only spreads if it's captioned with the right amount of humility-flavored bragging. This isn't an accident of design, it's the entire business. The platform profits every time you choose to broadcast instead of build, because broadcasting keeps you on the app, refreshing to see who noticed, while building keeps you off the app entirely, which earns the platform nothing. Understanding this changes how you interpret your own urge to post a milestone the second it happens. Sometimes the urge is healthy sharing. Often, if you're honest, it's a craving for the notification, dressed up as documentation. The test is the same one from earlier. Would you have done the thing, and felt just as satisfied, if posting it were somehow impossible? If the answer wavers, the platform has already recruited your ambition into its own business plan, and you didn't even notice the handshake. Consider a composite pattern that shows up constantly in the history of competitive fields, whether in sports, business, or the arts, once you strip away the names and just look at the shape of the story. In almost every era, there are two archetypes who enter at the same time, with similar raw talent, facing similar early doubt. The first archetype gets stung by criticism early and decides, right there, that the mission is to make the doubters eat their words. Every choice afterward gets filtered through that mission, the flashy move that gets attention over the fundamental that builds a floor under the skill, the rushed product launch to silence a specific critic rather than refined until it's actually ready. The public statement made to win an argument rather than the private hours spent actually closing the gap. For a while, this archetype often looks like it's winning, because proving generates spectacle, and spectacle looks like success from a distance. The second archetype gets stung by the same criticism and does something almost invisible in comparison. Nothing changes on the outside at all. No statement. No spectacle. Just a slightly longer training session that week. A slightly more honest self-review, one more unglamorous rep added to an already long list that nobody's counting except them. 10 years is the usual point where the gap becomes undeniable. The first archetype is often still relevant only within the specific argument they were trying to win, forever tethered to the doubters who defined their whole trajectory. The second archetype has usually moved so far past the original argument that the people involved in it aren't even in the same conversation anymore. This pattern repeats across so many fields, in so many eras, that it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a law, the same law from the first minute of this script, just proven out over a decade instead of stated in a sentence. This gives us a concrete productivity principle you can install this week, distinct from the auditing exercise mentioned earlier. Protect your first hour from proving entirely. Whatever your most important improving work is, the writing, the training, the coding, the practicing, do it before you check a single message, notification, or comment from anyone else. The reason is structural, not just about willpower. The instant you expose yourself to other people's opinions, requests, or judgments, some portion of your mental bandwidth quietly reallocates toward managing their perception of you, even if you don't consciously notice it happening. Protecting the first hour means your best cognitive resources go toward the one project immune to anyone else's opinion, your own skill, before the day's proving opportunities even get a chance to make their case for your attention. There's a subtler version of proving that rarely gets called by its real name: over-explaining. Justifying a decision nobody actually questioned, defending a choice before any objection was raised, narrating your efforts so thoroughly that the listener never has to wonder if you worked hard. All of it is proving wearing the costume of communication. Strategy, real strategy, rarely explains itself in advance. It just executes, and lets the result do whatever talking is actually necessary. Let's talk about the emotional intelligence piece specifically, because knowing all of this intellectually and actually applying it in the heated moment are two very different skills. The moment someone doubts you, questions you, or insults your ability, there's a physiological spike, faster heartbeat, tightened chest, a surge of adrenaline preparing you to respond immediately. This is the exact window where most people lose the game before it even starts, because they mistake the urgency of the feeling for the correctness of an immediate reaction. Emotional intelligence, at its most practical, is simply the ability to create a gap between that spike and your response, long enough to ask the earlier question again: is this signal, or is this bait? Is responding right now going toward my actual improvement, or only towards satisfying an ancient, misfiring alarm bell? That gap, even a few seconds long, is where all real self-mastery lies. Anyone can be calm when nothing is threatening them. The entire skill is being able to access that same calm in the exact 90 seconds when your pride is under attack, because that's the only moment the skill is actually being tested. Everything before that moment was just theory. Here's a perspective shift that changes how this whole idea feels, rather than just how it sounds. Proving is fundamentally reactive. It only exists because someone else acted first, doubted first, insulted first. That means every time you choose to prove something, you are, by definition, letting someone else set your agenda. Improving is fundamentally proactive. It exists because you decided, independent of anyone's opinion, what you wanted to become. One of these paths makes you the author of your life. The other makes you a supporting character in someone else's story about you, and you're doing all the writing for free. There's also a quieter, more personal cost worth naming honestly. Proving is exhausting in a way that improving is not, because proving requires constant defense. You have to keep the argument alive in your head, rehearsing the comeback, replaying the insult, drafting the version of events where you're vindicated. That's a second, invisible job running in the background of your mind, one that pays you nothing and never clocks out. Improving, once the habit is built, requires almost no emotional overhead at all. You simply do the next right action, log it, and move forward. There's no argument to sustain, because there was never an opponent to begin with, just a version of yourself, yesterday, that you're quietly outgrowing. So what does this actually look like as a daily practice, stripped of metaphor? Start by auditing where your energy currently goes. For 1 week, notice every time you feel the urge to respond, explain, justify, or showcase something specifically because of someone else's doubt or comment. Don't judge it yet. Just notice it, and write it down. At the end of the week, look at the list and ask, for each entry, the same question from earlier: Would I still take this exact action if that person never found out? The entries where the honest answer is no are your leaks. That is where your future has been quietly draining out through a hole you didn't know was there. Next, redirect that same energy, the same hours, the same intensity, toward one specific, measurable skill you actually want to build, and set the criteria for progress using only numbers or standards you control. Not likes. Not reactions. Not whether a specific person noticed. Repetitions, hours logged, revenue reinvested, pages written, pounds lifted, deals closed, whatever the honest unit of your craft is. Track it privately for a month before you tell anyone it exists. This single habit, improving in silence before ever seeking an audience, rebuilds the entire psychological wiring this script has been describing, one unwitnessed rep at a time. One more angle worth holding on to, because it stretches this idea beyond your own lifetime. Almost everyone eventually thinks about what they'll leave behind, for children, for a team, for a name people remember. It's worth noticing which of these two currencies actually survives that transition. Proof doesn't transfer. The specific argument you won, the specific doubter you silenced, the specific comment thread you finally settled, none of it means anything to someone who wasn't there for the original insult. You can't hand someone a grudge you finally resolved and expect it to carry any weight for them. It's a debt that was only ever denominated in your own history. Improvement transfers completely. A skill, a system, a standard of work, a habit of patience under pressure. These are things you can actually teach, model, and pass on, because they were never tied to a specific person's opinion in the first place. If you want to build something that outlasts the particular people who doubted you, it was never going to be the victory lap. It was always going to be the discipline itself, quietly handed to whoever comes next. Here's the paradox that closes this whole idea, and it's the part that changes everything once you actually see it. The less you chase proof, the more proof eventually arrives on its own, as a side effect rather than a goal. When your skill, your output, your results become undeniable through sheer accumulated improvement, you rarely need to argue your case anymore. The evidence simply walks into the room before you do. People who spent years insisting they'd be right eventually often find themselves still explaining, still defending, still trying to convince, because the proving was the entire strategy, and there was no underlying improvement to actually carry the weight. People who spent those same years quietly building rarely need to say anything at all. The work has already spoken, usually to people who never even asked the original question. That's the real prize hidden inside this idea. It was never about ignoring your critics for the sake of being unbothered. It was about recognizing that the energy you almost gave away to them is actually raw material for the only project that was ever fully yours. The slow, patient, unglamorous construction of a better version of yourself, brick by brick, on a schedule no one else gets to set. Take the time to improve. Every single day, if you can. But the moment you feel that old urge to prove, pause, notice it, and quietly hand that energy back to the version of you still under construction, because that's the only person who was ever actually owed it. If this changed the way you think about the people you're trying to prove something to, do 3 things right now before you move to the next video. Subscribe to Apex Motivation, because this channel exists to keep handing you frameworks like this one, not motivation that fades by tomorrow, but mental models you can actually use for the rest of your life. Like this video, because it directly tells the algorithm to put this exact message in front of someone else who's currently burning a year of their life trying to prove a point to someone who is never going to change their mind anyway. And share it with the one person you know who's stuck in that exact loop right now, the friend, the sibling, the coworker who's still fighting the last argument instead of building the next chapter. You might be the only reason they finally put that energy down and pick up something worth building instead. Improve quietly. Let the proof